We often mistake the strength of a regime for the stability of a country. Those are not the same.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. That our forces will be coming home as soon as their work is done. This will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory.
16 years ago, America went to war again. After invading Afghanistan in 2001, the United States turned its focus to Baghdad. Today, I'll examine the lingering effects of that decision with a man who has a rare glimpse of the dark side of battlefield victory in Iraq. Hello, everyone, and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, you knew that, and in this week's show, I sit down with Ben Taub of the New Yorker magazine. We'll talk ISIS, vengeance, and the future of a country that cost Americans an estimated $2 trillion. And then, to lighten things up, I have your considerably less expensive puppet regime.
Okay, let's start this nightmare. Hey, hi, and welcome back to Putting It Out There, your weekly call-in show with me.
But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on. The year was 1993. A balding man from Tulsa was about to take over the world's most powerful spy agency. With the Soviet Union gone, U.S. lawmakers considered cutting his budget. But this is how soon-to-be CIA Director James Woolley responded.
Yes, we have slain a large dragon, but we live now in a jungle filled with a bewildering variety of poisonous snakes. And in many ways, the dragon was easier to keep track of.
America's pretty good at confronting dragons. The Redcoats, the Nazis, the Soviets. But when it comes to snakes, let's be honest, there's more glory in slaying a dragon than a snake. As for Woolsey, he was talking about the complex security challenges that emerged after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Soviets were the slain dragon. Loose nukes, global terrorism were just a few of those snakes. And in Iraq, add Saddam Hussein. Seems even when you kill snakes, they can give way to more snakes if you're not careful. Once Saddam was knocked out of the picture, that's when the real problems began. I'm talking insurgency, Al-Qaeda, and then, of course, ISIS. At its height, ISIS controlled a stretch of territory that extended from western Syria all the way to the outskirts of Baghdad. But just last month, a coalition of US-backed Kurdish and Arab forces brought an end to its so-called Caliphate. The death knell came during the Battle of Baghouz in eastern Syria, the last major ISIS stronghold. Now the Caliphate may have been destroyed, but ISIS is not defeated. Just back in February, the Pentagon issued a report saying that ISIS fighters could regroup within 6 months to a year after the Americans pull their troops out of the country. According to the report, ISIS remains a potent force of battle-hardened and well-disciplined fighters that could likely resurge in Syria absent continued counterterrorism pressure. So pulling troops out is something they would not recommend. And in fact, a lot of those fighters fled to ungoverned spaces and other pockets in the north and in the west they say are hiding out until they can regroup. Apparently, some 2,000 ISIS militants today remain in Syria. U.S. Central Command thinks ISIS fighters will continue to conduct opportunistic attacks. And let's face it, if you want to get rid of ISIS as a concept, it's very hard to bomb them into submission. But even if ISIS doesn't come back, there are other snakes to confront. Remember, ISIS once held 34,000 square miles of territory, home to over 10 million residents. During that time, ISIS fighters took thousands of slaves and committed horrendous acts. In the Iraqi city of Mosul, they dominated for 3 years. And once ISIS was finally kicked out, many in Iraq engaged in a campaign of revenge. What actually happened, and what is still happening today, is the focus of our interview.
Was that part of it?
That element, yeah, but in the larger picture, right?
Ben Taub, staff writer with The New Yorker, and just recently back from Mosul, Iraq. Not where most of our viewers are considering taking their next vacation. Glad you're back in one piece.
Thank you.
And thanks for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
So let's go back to just Mosul for a moment, how this all started. I mean, this, of course, was large city in Iraq, run over by ISIS, was the biggest city that they took.
Second biggest city in Iraq.
When they had taken over Mosul, how many people are we talking about that were actively occupying?
It's around 8,000 were likely based in the city at its peak, but the city was actually taken with just a few hundred fighters. It was quite an extraordinary scene in June 2014. They swept across the desert from Syria, and it was a city that was guarded by some 30 to 60,000 federal Iraqi police and military forces who essentially shed their uniforms and fled within a week. So the group captured Mosul.
Against 800 fighters.
Yeah.
40,000 fled.
Yeah.
Because?
Well, the group was very cleverly harnessing its like multimedia propaganda machine in real time. So as they would capture neighborhoods and commit atrocities on anyone they found who was connected to the security forces, they would broadcast these brutal executions online, and the Iraqi forces stationed nearby would see that just a couple neighborhoods over, their colleagues and friends and relatives who were fighting there had been murdered in grisly ways. So there was a climate of fear that was perpetrated and perpetuated largely through the internet. But also, Mosul has a history of being a place where there was support for al-Qaeda and the insurgency in the past, over the past 15 years. And most of the security forces there were Shiite security forces who, in large part, I was told, were not especially interested in dying in defense of a largely Sunni city that they suspected had a lot of support from local population, which had been alienated by these same security forces, the Iraqi security forces, over the prior years. They'd been rounding up men and torturing them into false confessions of jihadi affiliation in the past. And so I spoke to women whose husbands joined ISIS and who told me that their husbands had never been sympathetic to any jihadi group until they'd been rounded up by the security forces in 2009, 10, 11, accused falsely of affiliation with al-Qaeda, tortured or beaten or imprisoned for long periods of time, and then eventually released.
What was Mosul then like as part of the Caliphate?
It was their strongest city. It was their economic powerhouse. An interesting...
a terrorist group controlling and governing the second largest city in Iraq.
It was a terrorist group that was beginning to behave like a state. And they had experience with it because much of the senior leadership within ISIS were former Ba'athist military and intelligence officers under Saddam Hussein. And when they were ousted from power in 2003 after the US invasion, these were not, hardcore jihadis. These were hardcore spies and military officers who had incredible tactical competence and knew how to run a police state, as they had been for the prior decades. Now they end up in prisons and detention centers with hardcore jihadis and realize this sort of brilliant and unholy alliance between them can combine the structural prowess of a police state with the cosmic certainty of a radical jihadi group that can mobilize large groups of disenfranchised young men. And so a lot of these ISIS leaders were really returning to power in areas that they knew how to govern and control from before.
In Sunni areas.
In Sunni areas.
Absolutely.
And they, the moment they retook Mosul, what was left behind were all of the trappings of a state. So they, yes, they took over the banks and had all the money and all of this, but this wasn't all. Like, now they had all the police stations and all the intelligence services offices, which would have files on all of the local residents. So when it comes time for them to do all of the necessary bureaucratic measures for running various offices, identifying, since they did a lot of ethnic cleansing. They were murdering Shiite families, enslaving Yazidis, and so on. And they had all of the files on everyone to do so, know exactly where everyone lives. So the structure of the Iraqi state that was left in such a hurry by Iraqi forces was one that they immediately were able to co-opt and knew how to co-opt because they'd done it before.
So for the Sunni population that was living there under ISIS, how did their life actually change? What was it like to experience that?
So you have a terrorist group that is behaving like a state, but is also in certain ways filling in the gaps of a failing state. They did certain things better than federal Iraq does. The courts were brutal and operated under strict Sharia law, but in some ways were more fair, less corrupt.
Less corrupt.
There was greater accountability within the legal system for ISIS fighters who committed crimes against the Sunni civilian population than there had been in the past for Iraqi security forces who committed crimes against the population. People could file complaints against ISIS fighters in court, and they would be taken seriously. That was not true and is not true in federal Iraq. This is all underscored by the incredible cruelty of the Islamic State, the incredible brutality of their punishments and their crimes, and the arbitrariness with which they meted out punishments. But, they did have serious aspirations to run a state, and they took that part of governance very seriously.
One thing that always struck me about ISIS strategy was this idea that you declare a caliphate, you take over a state, not only do you have to run it, but it then becomes something that's you have to hold. And it's a territory, as you said, you can't bomb an idea, but you can take a territory away. Like, governments,
it's
gone.
Yeah.
So what were they thinking?
This was a big, basically the split between ISIS and what is now separate Al-Qaeda was really over this question. The leaders of the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria were initially dispatched to Syria by Baghdadi, the head of the Islamic State. They had a big split in April 2013 over the question of the timing of the declaration of a caliphate. Al-Qaeda did not think that the group was ready to move forward in that way. And ISIS's leadership was more brazen and more bombastic and more eager to do it right now.
Did they want stuff? I mean, nihilism doesn't usually go well with governance, right? I mean, did they want stuff?
Stuff as in?
Like the trappings of a government. Was it partially about, like, we want epaulets, we want the ability to be in an office and, like, sort of tell people what to do? Was that part of it?
I imagine I'm sure that was a consideration. I'm not, I'm not one of them. I can't speak to what was going on in their heads. But I would say...
You tell me now.
I would say that I don't think that we should discount how important it was for the former Baathists to feel like this was a return to power. And I think for many of them, they were not terribly religious guys in the past. They were successful in this state-building project because of the religious narrative tied to it. But I think for them, this was 15 years after they lost their lives and careers and had to go on the run. They were controlling large parts of Iraq again. And we're not far from taking Baghdad at a certain point. In 2014, that summer, they were getting close. There was a real chance that Baghdad would fall, and these guys would once again be in the positions of power they had been 15 years before.
So you get to Mosul. You've obviously never been there before. Given your expectations, the place that so many of us had been talking about in the news was dominating coverage of Iraq for quite some time. What was the first thing that threw you for a loop, that really surprised you when you get on the ground?
The question of what counts as affiliation is really a lot murkier and complex in Iraq than it is contemplating it from afar, or when we
affiliation
with a terrorist group of any sort, really. But especially ISIS in Iraq is a different thing than it is when we think of ISIS recruits coming from Europe, carrying out attacks in Europe. People who traveled from far away to be part of this project were there to form a caliphate. And that was the fulfillment of this prophecy and this vision and this dream. People who lived in Iraq, it was a much more complex issue. You had not just the recruit traveling, you had the recruits, someone who joins the group, it affects their entire family in very complicated ways. You would have people who hated ISIS and people who joined ISIS living in the same house. And they were family before they were, joining ISIS didn't
ruin Thanksgiving? Because in the U.S., right, I mean, like politics, which are fundamentally almost identical in terms of the spectrum, like compared to what we're talking about here, I mean, people just going completely nuts over, my God, they voted for Trump, wanted Hillary. You're talking about literally people that supported a terrorist organization as opposed to, in the same household.
In the same household.
How do you deal with that?
I think that's actually a really interesting and good comparison in the sense that, like, people can very easily relate to the idea that you have, this uncle and aunt who support Trump and no one in your family does, or the contrary. And that seems very normal and like kind of annoying here.
Yeah.
It's a source of tension and frustration within the family, but it doesn't result in a bloodbath at home over dinner. That's the same in Iraq in this circumstance. But the consequence now is that in the aftermath of the Islamic State, anyone who is so tangentially related to anyone else who is in the group is now considered to be a part of the group. You are
not by the family, but by the government.
By the government. By the government and by various militias, sectarian militias that are carrying out massacres of Sunnis, and in fact, which the government is providing cover for by lying about the provenance of mass graves, taking journalists to scenes where Shiite militia groups have murdered large numbers of Sunnis who are thought, in some women and children who may have had, male relatives who joined ISIS, massacre the whole group, bury them in a mass grave, bring journalists in, show the journalists, and say, look what ISIS did.
So if I'm a member of a family of someone who joined ISIS, then I am effectively guilty of murder?
If I murdered someone on camera with my face shown, and you were my brother, it's pretty likely we would both experience a 3 or 4 minute trial, which would result in death sentences.
Equally likely.
Equally likely.
Yeah, that's pretty insane.
Yeah, it's a 98% conviction rate.
How far out does this go? Is it just immediate family, or is it like...
Cousins. Officially, they're camps for internally displaced Iraqis. In practice, they're turning into camps for ISIS families, and they're essentially detention camps out in the desert. These are women and children and distant relatives of men who joined the group. And some of them, in fact, had no relatives who joined, but are simply perceived as having relatives who joined. I spoke to a woman, for example, whose husband didn't join ISIS, but his brothers did. So then he was detained as an ISIS fighter, tortured into a false confession, probably sentenced to death. And she, who wasn't married to an ISIS fighter, is now considered an ISIS widow. And so her children are considered to be ISIS children. If they were under 4 or 5 years old, the only documents they would have would be ISIS birth certificates, which the Iraqi government will not replace or recognize. And therefore, these children are growing up stateless within their own state. We're talking about tens of thousands of people. And if you take entire networks of families, including cousins, aunts, and so on, hundreds of thousands of people are being punished by their supposed liberators for essentially the crime of having lived in Mosul under the Islamic State.
So you profiled this one fellow that lived in the old city. How did you find him? Who is he?
So his name is Thanoon Yunus Abdullah, and I found him in the old city climbing up a 3-story pile of rubble, which had been the site of his former home, trying to retrieve some belongings with his wife and their kids. And he described to me his escape in the final days of the battle when the bombardment was so intense. He and his family made the decision, for 3 years they had been living under ISIS. They hated the group, but they saw no choice. They were too poor to find other places to live. And they also had been following the advice of the Iraqi army, which was to stay behind until you're liberated. At a certain point, it became clear that their neighborhood was surrounded and it was going to be a total bloodbath, and that the forces that had surrounded it considered civilians like him to be sympathetic to the group by virtue of the fact that they hadn't left. So his neighborhood and his home are very close to the Tigris River. One night, when the conditions had become unlivable, people were starving and being killed every day, he took his family, he took some inner tubes and took his wife and his kids and ran down to the river in the dead of night. He and his wife climbed into the inner tubes and put their children in 2 large coolers and floated down the Tigris until they reached a liberated territory on the other side. A year and a half later was when I found him going through the rubble for the first time, having returned in a car whose windshield had been destroyed by an errant shell, trying to find what they could, recover what they could. Everything of value had been stolen or destroyed. And inside the home, he found that it had been taken over by ISIS fighters and had been used as a staging ground for, we found bomb-making materials inside, IEDs, and several bodies of fighters as well as the body of his mother-in-law, who was too frail to leave.
Were you harassed at all when you were there on the ground?
I was detained by a militia in the old city of Mosul.
For how long?
3 hours. They were questioning me, photographed my passport, photographed my visa and my face. And this was a group that is widely known to be funded, trained, and equipped, and have an intelligence sharing agreement with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And I suspect that my details were sent to members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
Another place you will not be trying to get a visa anytime soon.
I would actually be very curious to visit Iran as a tourist.
Did they know you were a journalist when they picked you up?
Yes, they knew. They were, as is the typical accusation, they were trying to screen me to make sure I wasn't a spy or an ISIS fighter. After 3 hours and many questions and going through every photo on my camera, everything on my phone, they received word that I should be released. This was a group of around 12 people, including a commander, and then escorted me out of the old city and said if I ever returned, I'd be arrested.
To what extent is Mosul coming back?
So Mosul is bisected.
And you said 2 million people.
Yeah.
Right, and some of it completely destroyed.
Yeah.
I assume a lot of infrastructure was completely destroyed.
Ruined, yeah.
So these people need livelihoods. What's happening now?
Mosul is bisected by the Tigris River, and East Mosul is really returning to a sense of like a flourishing, normal life. People are trying hard to open up cultural institutions and get back on track. And there's been a great deal of reconstruction in that area. West Mosul is a completely different story. That was where ISIS made its final stand. It's being completely neglected, seemingly as a kind of punishment, and the rubble is not being cleaned up.
So now that you're back, having spent the time that you've spent on the ground in Mosul, experienced what you've experienced, if you could tell the American government to do anything differently going forward, the benefits of that experience, what would it be?
There are 2 wars. One is the reality on the ground, where American forces will rightly say, we did not supply Shiite paramilitary groups with weapons and support. But Iraqi civilians might perceive them as having done so. And that matters just as much as if they actually had done it. In a nutshell, we have to recognize that strengthening a security apparatus, a regime, or an autocrat is not the same thing as building stability in a country.
Ben Taub, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now for something completely different, I've got your puppet regime.
Okay, let's start this nightmare. Hey, hi, and welcome back to Putting It Out There, your weekly call-in show with me, President of Russia. Okay, our first question this week comes by email from Peggy in Staten Island, who asks, let me just read here, my basement is flooded with sewage backup and city will not do anything to help me with this problem. Look, what I would do in Russia, if it were me, okay, the first thing I would do is that I would call up the mayor and poison him to death. If it were me. But good luck with your problem, Peggy. Thank you for writing. Okay, next up we have a call from Anthony in Far Rockaway.
Hi, Vladimir, a long-time fan of yours. Thank you for taking my call.
No problem, Anthony. Put it out there.
Well, it's my son, alright? He's in middle school. You know, he's always getting picked on. He's always, I don't know what to do about it.
Oh, picked on. Look, I know what that's like. Believe me, whole of 1990s, Russia was picked on and picked on and picked on. And let me tell you, it does not feel good. But Anthony, let me ask you, can your weakling son use a computer? Like coding and this stuff?
Yeah, we got a computer in the house. He's pretty good with it, yeah.
Great. Well, you tell that weakling son of yours that, look, he may never be as strong as other boys, but with computer, like hacker, boom, he can destroy their lives forever.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, Vladimir.
Alright, calm down, Slick. Next call comes from Donald in Washington. Donald, live, put it out there.
That's our show this week. We'll be back next week. Don't miss it. Please don't miss it. It's important to me that every week you keep watching. I really need that, just personally. But in the meantime, if you like what we've seen, check us out on GZEROmedia.com.